In this video, I'm going to show you how I finished up building this built-in that specifically holds a fireplace insert. I'm going to show you the install as well as putting in the fireplace insert, which was actually pretty easy. This is what the finished product looks like in the customer's house with all of their stuff on it. It fit in the space pretty perfectly. So in the first video, I showed you how I made this main central section, which had the doors as well as the insert opening for the fireplace. I'm going to start off by showing you how I build the bookcases. So the bookcases are going to be pretty standard for my shop. The main difference is, like the main unit, there's a cutout in the back so that they could hide all the wires back there. But I'm just going to have a top and a bottom and a middle shelf. The bottom and the top shelf are going to come down an inch so that I can have an inch face frame on the top. The inch on the bottom will give me a little bit of a foot so that the entire carcass is not sitting on the floor. And then the shelf is going to go slap dab right in the middle of the whole unit. So you can see with the dado stack and the radial arm saw, I could go through and cut the top and the bottom. Now I had already cut out the backer. Order of operations got the best of me on this one, so I'm using a little piece in order to cut out that middle section because I had now have the L on there. So it would have been a little bit easier to cut all my dados beforehand, but that is basically what I'm working with. And then I'm going to put a 1/2 inch backer on both of these units. So on this one, because the back of the unit doesn't go all the way back to that angled section, it stops. I'm going to put essentially a dado that's turning into a rabbit right through the middle of this piece, and then it will make more sense once you see it all together. But it's essentially a deeper unit that has a shallow shelf, and then the back will have the holder for where they're hiding wires. I'm going to put an integrated tongue on all of these pieces like I do with all of my cabinet work. So in order to do that, I like to cut that tongue all at once, so I cut all of my shelves. This is what that tongue looks like. It's basically just a little slab of that ply, so I'm going roughly 1/4 inch in on either side, leaving a little bit of a tongue. It's about 1/4 inch tongue, and it protrudes about 3/8 inch. And then you saw with that oak face frame, I can then cut a groove on that oak face frame, and it will attach right to the front of the cabinet. So when I say integrated spline, that's what I'm cutting right here. So it's just 2 grooves on the front side of that cabinet, but it's also going to be grooves on the bottom shelf, the top shelf, as well as the middle shelf. It's easiest to cut all that stuff at once, so usually after I make the sides of my cabinets, I'll go through and just rough cut all my middle partitions so I could cut the integrated spline on them as well, and if need be, I will cut them down to depth and width afterwards. For the backer, like I said, it's 1/2 inch material. So I couldn't cut this because these are about 24 inches tall, so it was just easier to cut all this with a circular saw. So that's all I'm doing right there. And then I could glue up these basic bookshelves. These were roughly 24 inches tall by about 15 inches deep, and the whole unit's 15 inches deep. The part that holds the shelves was more like 9 inches deep, and then it's also about roughly 36 inches wide. So you can see with all those grooves, it's really easy to plop my pieces into place. I'll use brads to start off with just to hold everything as I'm gluing it up and moving it around. But once it's all said and done, because you'll never see the sides of any of these units because it's a wall-to-wall built-in, I'll go through and add screws to the outer side of this just to shore everything up. And also because these aren't super wide, I could add some clamps to it as well. But that's basically, like I said, putting some brads in it just to hold it into place. I can square everything up and then add the screws. So I built 2 of these. They both flank that fireplace section. And that is basically what those 2 units look like. Like I said, now I could go through and add those screws. These screws are going to act like clamps. They'll pull the wood together as everything dries. For the face frame, everything's going to be solid oak. I've been getting my oak from Rockler. It has a really good price, and it's super close to me. It's a much better deal than going to the Lowe's. And I had some left over from another project. I need a bunch, so I could rough cut everything, and then I could go through and start putting my grooves on all my pieces. And like I said, you could see it's just going to snap right onto the front. The only downside to this situation is when you put your stiles on, which is your vertical pieces, and they intersect part of your rails, you have to remove a little bit of that integrated spline. And I just use a saw and a chisel to do that. It's pretty quick work. I'm putting a spacer between the bookshelves as well as the main unit, because I know the bookshelves, since they don't have a base underneath of them, are probably going to have to be shimmed and tweaked. So I'm just giving myself a little bit of a spacer. So that's all I did. I attached some scrap piece of lumber to the inside, and you could see now it's set off that intersection a little bit. The problem with my shop is, and this is like a 15-foot unit, the floor is not perfectly square, so I squared up the middle unit, and then I squared up the two bookshelves as well, just using shims as best as I could, so when I transfer it to the space, it's as accurate as possible. I keep the stiles that are going to meet the walls wide, and then I'll scribe them down to size. This customer only lives about 5 minutes from me, which is really convenient. It means I could bring pieces back to the shop to cut them down, which I'll have to do on the two end stiles as well as the top, and it just makes my life easier to be able to do that in the shop, because I don't do a ton of on-site work. I just don't have a lot of tools that transfer easily to people's homes. Once I have the two stiles in place, you saw I could just calculate and add the groove to all of my face frame parts that are going on the shelves, so they'll be flush with the top shelf, and I could just cut them down the radial arm saw and snap them into place. Before I continue, I attached the hinges to the two doors that I made in last week's video. I kept the back off so I could prop the hinges in place, get the door set exactly where I want it, can put my pencil marks on the inside so I don't have to do any sort of math or calculating. Then I could pre-drill those holes and attach my door, and that is pretty simple how I did that. Now these are inset hinges. They make inset face frame hinges, but technically the face frame hinges wouldn't have attached well to this, so I just decided to use that spacer on the side. And then once I had the doors in place, I could finally go and put my backer pieces on. I kind of showed myself dry fitting these last week. This week I could kind of prop them all into place. You could see the top, because it's so long, has bowed a little bit. So this top part I had to hammer into place. But once it's in place, I could screw and brad it into my partitions, and it really solidified up the entire piece. That backer that's going on the top shelf there, I add a little bit later in the video, and then just clamp everything together as the glue dries. And then that is basically what it looks like with the face frame on the bookshelves, and then that center partition in place as well. And now I could go about starting to work on the top. So the top is going to be 3 separate pieces of ply. That central piece is about 80 inches wide, so I knew I had to use multiple pieces. I told the customer I can make it out of plywood, but I'm not going to be able to match the grain because it's long pieces. Really, no matter how you do it with this lumber from Lowe's, it would be hard to match. They understood that. They were fine with it. It was something that wasn't going to bother them, and it would cost the least amount of money to do it the way that I'm doing it. I mentioned that because I posted a clip of this on TikTok, and multiple people commenting on the grain match. And sometimes when you're working for clients, I'll give them various options, and they take the best path forward with what they want, and stuff like that does not bother me if they don't care if it's grain matched. So then to attach my pieces, I'm putting splines and grooves in all of them. It's easier to cut these bigger pieces with splines with a portable router than it is to send them all on the table saw. So I just used a grooving bit and put a groove on the edges in the front of my tabletop pieces. The 2 edges I left long, I'll cut them down in the space, and then everything will be combined with 1/4 inch MDF because I'm using a 1/4 inch groove bit. And as you can see, like I said, the top is going to be 1 sheet of ply, but the grain will not match on that. For the front, it's going to be edge banding essentially, but I'm going to be attaching it with that spline and groove, and this is just roughly about 3/4 inch front. So I'm going to add a T on it, and instead of using a groove on this piece, you could put a groove on this and then just put a movable spline in between. But for something like this, it was easy enough to just send it through the table saw twice, flip it over on edge, and essentially make a T molding, and this T molding will fit into that front that I just created on the tabletop. So that's what that looks like, and you'll see it will snap into place. One of the reasons I decided to do this is you could see now how there's 2 depths to the unit, so I have to put some small miters in order to go around that groove, and I just like the way that everything attached better with that tongue on the piece versus a removable spline. And then in order to cut all those miters, sometimes I do these on the miter saw, but I had been cutting a lot of metal on my miter saw, and I was getting some burning tear out on all my edges, so I just set up a 45 on the crosscut sled, and I could cut really clean 45s. So I cut up 45 on the end of a long piece, and then I can mark where it needs to go using the front edge of the piece on the long tabletop, and I could bring it to the table saw and cut it safely because I left a bunch of material on there, and those are going to be my little, I'm calling them little ear pieces that fit into that groove. Now the problem with the tabletop was I kind of had to pick and choose what I glued together, so these little pieces I decided to keep separate until I got on site so that I would be able to adjust the tabletop into the space, because it is wall to wall. You're not going to have a ton of removability, but you can see how those miters are kind of crisp and clean around that edge, and that's how I made the top. So then I could go through and glue all of my face frames. I don't glue on the wide stiles that are going against the wall because, like I said, those will have to be scribed. And then for these central units, I just made a cambered caul, which is essentially a flat piece of wood, but you take about a 1/16 of an inch off of the edges, so you could see it's cambered. It doesn't set perfectly flush on the edges, so that when you attach clamps to it, that little bit of material that you remove on the edges, when you clamp it, forces pressure in the middle, and that's how you can kind of apply pressure to the middle of a piece if you don't have a bunch of really deep clamps to work with. Now on the top and the bottom it was easier to clamp because I could just go off the top and the bottom, but in the middle I didn't have long enough clamps in order to do that, and that's when cambered cauls really come in handy. For the backer, I decided to cut 2 grooves and add just some little shims in there because it's such a long piece. I didn't want it to sag over time, so you could see how those 2 little slats will now fit inside the cabinet. Once the fireplace is in place, you'll never see any of that. So once the doors were in place, the customer decided they didn't want any hardware on them, which I agreed with because the grain match was so good on this. It would kind of break up the visual run if you put hardware on it. It would also have it kind of butt out into space when this is a very simple streamlined piece. So we decided to use push to open hardware, but because of the way I cut the doors, there was no great place to put the hardware. So I made these large spacer blocks that are going to go on the top of the cabinet, and they'll hold the hardware for the push to open door. I decided to miter them and join them nicely so I don't have to deal with edge banding plywood. The push to open hardware was just something I got off of Amazon. There's tons of choices. I just went with one that had decent reviews. You could see how it's going to set on that block. It has elongated holes, so I'm going to only put 2 screws in to start, and you could see once I put it in there how it sits now flush on the inside of that cabinet, and you won't see the hardware. I didn't want to put it on the side or the bottom and you saw that big metal blocky piece of hardware because this is going to have a top on it. I could glue right into that block from the top of the cabinet carcass, and then my top will fit over top of it. And the push to open hardware worked really nicely. It kind of negates the soft close of the hinges, but I told the customer that ahead of time. I went through and sanded everything, put some pre-stain on it, and then they chose a stain from Midwax called Gunstock, which has kind of a reddish orange hue to it. I put a coat of that on. I let it set for 72 hours so that I didn't have to worry about the stain lifting. And then I put like 5 or 6 coats of General Finishes water-based finish on there. This is a semi-gloss, and I was able to spray all that, which is nice. So that is what my pieces look like separated. In the space, I could bring everything in, and I had to remove some of the molding. The first step to this process is leveling and setting that center base in place. So I'm using some leveling blocks, and because I took the molding off, it was easy to see the studs. So I also have it sunk into that back wall, and then you can see the leveling blocks on the side are going to lift up the front. It's very common for the floors to slope gradually away from the walls. So you can see there's about 1/4 inch of a slope. So I just use the leveling blocks in order to get it so it's that same plane on the back and the front. Once that's done, I can lift this unit into place, and you can see it kind of slides right in there because of how I designed it, and that is what that looks like. And then I could go and attach the bookshelves. They should butt right up next to the main unit pretty nicely, and really all I had to do on this was cut one edge of the top and my 2 stiles. It was very easy, almost like a plop-in piece of furniture with a couple of adjustments. To attach the books shelves to the main unit, you can see I just sunk some screws into the oak face frame, which will be the hardiest piece of that run. And then you could see the bookshelves, because they don't have a floating base, I had to shim them a little bit. I could get measurements for my stiles because the walls are never flat. So I could get the measurement at the top of the stile, the measurement at the bottom, draw a diagonal, and then I could route those clean. This was the part I mentioned I was able to do back in my shop, which was really nice. I could get those measurements, take them back to the shop, and cut everything down without worrying about making a huge mess. So I have my straight edge, I clamped a piece of ply to the top, and I could use a flush cut trim bit in order to just trace that line. So now that piece of ply that's sitting on top of my line is going to track perfectly with the bearing on the router bit and give me that flush cut. And if you paused on the measurements, you'll see the top and the bottom were different by about 1/8 of an inch. So if you put a flat piece against the wall, you'll have gaps from top to bottom. I could run back to the customer's house and then slide this back into place. You can see how now it fits perfectly against the wall. Especially on stayed grade finishes, this isn't something I could just come in and caulk and paint over. So it's really important that it fits tightly in that corner. And then the one top I didn't end up having to cut, that one I did it the exact same way. You could see I got stain all over the customer's wall, which is unfortunately sometimes part of installing furniture. For this part of the top, I removed the bottom that I had made that spline with because it wouldn't be able to slide it into place. So this one now pops into place and I could slide it against the wall. I obviously had to go get some paint mix in order to fix their wall, which is one of the reasons I don't love working in people's homes. Kind of a tornado in my shop, and that never really transfers well to other people's homes. And then I could also glue in that last little piece of material. And then that is what that looks like. This was a pretty quick install. I did this in a little under a day because, like I said, it only had a couple cuts. And now the sides and the top are almost perfectly flush with the walls. In order to attach the top to the bookshelves, you can see I just sunk screws up from the bottom of the bookshelf into the top. Once again, against the wall, I have just about as perfect as it's going to get fit. And I didn't film making this, but with some of the scrap red oak I had, I made some very streamlined, no detail trim for the bottom because I knew I'd have to shim these and you'd have gaps against the floor, so I also trimmed out the bottom. For the fireplace, the customer ordered this on Amazon. It was really simple because I'm using a hardwood base. I basically just had to plop this into my opening. Obviously you have to make the opening the right size, but I got the measurements online, and then I could just screw, there's 4 screw holes in this that go right into my ply, so I didn't have to use anchors or anything like that. And then once the screws were in place, the glass front for this has very streamlined thin metal French cleats that slide right into the top of the fireplace. So you can see I just can kind of lift this up and then slide it down, and then that was how the whole unit attached. And obviously when you're building something to fit in a unit like this, it's always a sigh of relief when everything fits. I had to drill a hole through the back of the cabinet box in order for the wires to come out the back. But it kind of makes more sense seeing why they have that gap in the back now to hide all the wires. And that is basically what this looks like in the customer's house. So I was pretty happy with the way this turned out. It's always nice when these bigger units fit. You can see how the electric is clear in the back and the wires will all fit in the back. And then they accidentally chipped it a little bit when they were putting the TV on there, so I came back real quick to do a touch-up, and they were nice enough to let me take some pictures with all their stuff in place.